In the last weeks of the war, Hitler was reviewing reports and maps that no longer matched reality. Orders kept going out, plans were drafted, while the front was collapsing on all sides. The idea of a last stand began to take shape, more out of inertia than strategy. Whole divisions existed only on paper. Communications failed. The commanders awaited instructions that never arrived. Each new order demanded the impossible: hold every position, fight without ammunition, reject any retreat. The general headquarters continued to operate, disconnected from the front, driven by routine and the fear of punishment. At what point did it stop being planning and become denial? What was really being upheld with those orders? How long can a war last when there is no one left willing to believe in it? The collapse of the Reich, the beginning of the total downfall. In September of 1944, the Third Reich enters its terminal phase. The fronts extend beyond any logistical capacity and begin to collapse simultaneously in the east and in the west. The defeat in Normandy and the annihilation of the Army Group Center during Operation Bagration eliminate any possibility of strategic maneuver. The records of the Army High Command reflect the monthly loss of entire divisions and the progressive dissolution of reserves. The new formations arriving at the lines lack armored vehicles and are composed of teenage recruits or convalescent soldiers. The military structure of the Reich is sustained only by administrative inertia. At the Rastenburg headquarters known as the Wolfschanze, Adolf Hitler continues to direct the war from maps that no longer represent reality. The July 20th assassination attempt has left him physically weakened and deeply distrustful. Since August, he decides to intervene directly in the movements of divisions and army corps, cancelling the autonomy of the commands. In a conference on September 1st, according to Heinz Guderian's records, he rejects any withdrawal and proclaims that the territory conquered with blood must never be surrendered. In his view, to retreat is to betray the nation. The tactical principle of elastic defense, advocated by Marshal von Rundstedt, proposes withdrawing to shorter lines to concentrate resources and stabilize the fronts. The calculations of the General Staff show that an orderly withdrawal behind the Rhine would allow for the recovery of operational capability. Hitler interprets the proposal as cowardice. On the 3rd of September, he issues Führer Directive No. 63, prohibiting any withdrawal without his personal authorization. In the archives of the Wehrmacht High Command, there is a marginal note from General Jodl: "This is not strategy, it is institutionalized immobility." From that moment, the commanders describe a paralyzed military system. The panzer divisions can no longer carry out mobile counterattacks due to a lack of fuel. The Luftwaffe has lost air control and suffers from a shortage of pilots. The railway, subjected to constant bombings, transports refugees instead of ammunition. Guderian writes to his wife that the front is maintained by the will of a single man, but that will is imposed against all material reality. Between September and November, the discussions between Hitler and his generals reach a level of open confrontation. Rundstedt from the Western Front warns that the Meuse line cannot be held. Walter Model reports that the loss of Arnhem and the Dutch breakthrough leave Germany without natural defenses. Hitler interrupts both reports and states that the resistance will not be sustained in geography but in faith. The notion of will as a military force replaces operational planning. The protocols of the military conferences, preserved in the archives of the Institute for Contemporary History, show the tone of those meetings. In a session on the 19th of October, Guderian proposes to retreat from Poland to the Oder line. Hitler accuses him of defeatism, and that same night orders the execution of several officers accused of abandoning positions in East Prussia. The executions, carried out by SS firing squads in Heiligenbeil, establish a climate of terror within the command. The officers learn to silence negative reports. The chain of command becomes a circuit of silences. Reports from the Armaments Office record that in October of 1944, the production of synthetic fuel falls catastrophically after the Allied bombings on Leuna and Pölitz. The reserves are no longer sufficient to sustain simultaneous operations. The railway network, without coal or locomotives, is disorganized. In an internal note dated the 6th of November, the High Command admits that the army is fighting without fuel, without mobility, and without coordination. Hitler's response is to decree the total mobilization of the German people. Recruitment is expanded to men between 16 and 60 years, creating the Volkssturm, an improvised militia that symbolizes the transition from a military strategy to an ideological resistance. Hitler begins to replace career officers with loyal politicians. On the 21st of September, he dismisses Guderian as inspector of armored forces and personally assumes that function. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, is appointed commander of Army Group Vistula without operational experience. Keitel and Jodl at the High Command are limited to transmitting orders without veto power. The command structure closes in on itself. Directives travel from Berlin to divisions that no longer exist. Official documents continue to list destroyed units as if they persisted on the ground. In the Wolf's Lair, the last weeks unfold in an atmosphere of constant tension. The conferences last for hours. Hitler questions each section chief about losses, reserves, and movements, rejecting any data that contradicts his expectations. The tone becomes inquisitorial. According to the notes of Nicholas von Below, his air aide, the Führer declares on the 27th of October that Germany will not fall due to a lack of weapons, but due to a lack of character. He insists that will is the decisive weapon. At that moment, the line between political conviction and military direction completely dissolves. By November, the idea of total resistance becomes the doctrinal basis of the regime. Joseph Goebbels reinforces the concept in his speeches and in his diary. If the German people cannot win, they must demonstrate their ability to die. Radio broadcasts repeat the terms Endsieg and Opferwille, final victory and will to sacrifice, seeking to transform military defeat into a moral mandate. UFA newsreels present images of bombed cities with messages of perseverance, while refugees navigate destroyed roads under a propaganda apparatus that insists on the inevitable victory. Hitler assumes this logic in every meeting with his subordinates. In his speech to the Gauleiter on the 12th of November, preserved in recordings of the Chancellery, he proclaims that history does not remember those who surrender but those who fall fighting. He states that every German city will be a fortress, every street a battlefield. That declaration anticipates the conversion of the territory into a system of Festungen, fortified places that must resist until the last man. The orders for civilian evacuation are suspended. The motto of not abandoning the ground under any circumstances is imposed. Total war transforms into static war, sustained by the denial of movement. The result is a combination of strategic paralysis and internal repression. The regional commanders, fearful of being accused of treason, obey even impossible orders. The divisions without ammunition continue to appear in the daily reports. Communications are interrupted by the destruction of telephone networks. Inside Germany, the Allied bombings on Hamburg, Essen and Düsseldorf reduce the industrial capacity to a fraction of what it had been 1 year before. The armament factories are relocated to tunnels or abandoned mines. The forced workers, coming from occupied territories, work in extreme conditions under the supervision of the SS. The Reich's economy collapses while official slogans insist on the final victory. In the reports of the General Staff, the contrast between bureaucratic language and the reality of the front is perceived. The daily reports use terms like heroic resistance or situation controlled, but in the margins, the officers note irreparable losses of men and material. The Central Command no longer distinguishes between true reports and internal propaganda. The military apparatus remains active only because obedience has become an automatic reflex. On the 24th of November, Hitler leaves the Wolfschanze and moves permanently to the Chancellery in Berlin. The decision marks a symbolic change. Rastenburg ceases to be the command center and becomes a relic of a war that can no longer be directed. In Berlin, Hitler orders the strengthening of urban defense and the construction of obstacle lines around the capital. Improvised engineer units are created and young members of the Hitler Youth are trained for urban combat. The The preparation for the siege begins before the enemy is in sight. The illusion of the counteroffensive, Hitler's last gamble. In the winter of 1944, while the Eastern Front collapses and the Allied armies advance towards the Rhine, Adolf Hitler conceives the idea of an offensive capable of altering the course of the war. In his interpretation, the Reich is not yet defeated. He believes that a strategic blow could divide his enemies and demonstrate that Germany retains military power. From that conviction arises the last great German offensive operation on the Western Front, the Battle of the Ardennes. After the collapse in Normandy and the breaking of the Western defensive line, the Wehrmacht has lost all initiative. The Allies advance through French territory and threaten the German border, while the Soviet Union pressures from the Vistula. The strategic reserves have been depleted, but Hitler maintains that a surprise attack could fracture the enemy coalition and restore political balance. His proposal does not stem from the operational analysis of the General Staff, but rather from a personal decision that ignores the material limitations of his army. The idea of repeating the movement of 1940 through the Ardennes Massif aims to surprise the Allies, considered confident after months of continuous advance. The central objective is to capture the port of Antwerp. If achieved, the British and American forces would be separated, and the Western Front would suffer a temporary collapse. Hitler trusts that such a victory would force the Western Allies to negotiate, allowing him to concentrate the remaining forces against the Soviet Union. It is a political reasoning disguised as a military strategy. The project is codenamed Wacht am Rhein. At the end of October 1944, the army groups in the West are restructured to execute it. On paper, more than 400,000 troops and around 1,400 armored pieces will participate in the offensive. In practice, the units are incomplete, many reconstituted with inexperienced recruits and remaining material. The High Command's reports acknowledge that there are barely enough reserves for 1 week of combat. Fuel becomes the main problem. The Allied bombings on the Leuna and Politz plants have drastically reduced production. Planners calculate that the German tanks will have to refuel with fuel captured from the enemy during the advance, an assumption that reveals the degree of improvisation. The plan also ignores the state of communications. The mountain routes, narrow and snow-covered, are inadequate for a rapid movement of large mechanized formations. Preparations are made under extreme secrecy. Hitler fears both opposition from the High Command and a leak that would alert the Allies. Orders are transmitted orally to army commanders only a few days before the attack. This method, conceived to preserve surprise, produces the opposite effect: an operation without effective coordination between the different levels of command. The Wehrmacht enters the offensive with incomplete information and without a coherent logistical system. The chosen sector is the Ardennes Massif, a wooded region of Belgium and Luxembourg that the Allies consider secondary. Precisely for this reason it is chosen. 3 armies will participate in the attack. The 6th Panzer Army, made up of Waffen-SS divisions, will attack from the north. The 5th Panzer Army, formed by units of the regular army, will advance through the center. The 7th Army will cover the southern flank. The goal is to open a gap in the American lines, cross the Meuse River, and seize Antwerp. Hitler trusts that bad weather will prevent the action of the Allied aviation and prolong the element of surprise. To disguise the preparations, German propaganda spreads the image of an army focused on defense. Meanwhile, more than 1,000 night trains transport troops and material to the Eifel region. The concentration operation goes unnoticed by Allied intelligence services. In the early morning of the 16th of December 1944 at 5:30, a barrage of artillery breaks the winter silence between Monschau and Echternach. Under a dense fog, the German divisions cross the Aar River and penetrate the American lines. The American vanguard units, young and inexperienced, are taken by surprise. During the first 48 hours, the attack achieves a significant advance. The surprise is complete, and the bad weather prevents aerial observation. The Allied artillery responds without precision. The German columns advance along forest roads, capture fuel depots, and expand the gap to tens of kilometers. On the surface, the plan works. However, the lack of coordination between the three armies soon becomes apparent. Traffic jams block the routes, the vanguard units outpace their support infantry, and the artillery falls behind. The situation reports show an irregular front, sustained by interrupted communications and by a central command that insists on advancing despite the lack of fuel. The critical point of the offensive is concentrated in the Belgian city of Bastogne, a crucial road junction for both sides. The 101st Airborne Division from the United States is sent urgently for its defense. The German armored units encircle the town with the expectation of a rapid collapse, but the resistance holds and the siege prolongs. While the German forces spend time and resources on the siege, the Allied command reorganizes its lines and concentrates reserves. The initiative begins to shift. On the 23rd of December, the change in weather alters the course of the operation. The sky clears, and the Allied aviation regains control of the air. Fighter bombers attack the German columns, destroy ammunition depots, and annihilate entire convoys. The offensive loses momentum. The tanks run out of fuel, the vehicles are abandoned, and many are destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Mobility disappears, and with it the possibility of reaching the Meuse. The following days turn the initial penetration into an isolated pocket of resistance. At the end of December, the German armies can no longer advance. The winter worsens the conditions. The troops lack food and heating, and supplies do not reach the front. The armored vehicles that had managed to penetrate further are immobilized. Bastogne is finally liberated by American forces on the 26th of December. From then on, the offensive turns into a chaotic withdrawal. Reports from the United States Army and the German High Command itself agree on the magnitude of the losses. More than 80,000 casualties, including dead, wounded, and prisoners, along with the destruction of a large part of the remaining armored material. The failure of the Ardennes seals the military fate of the Reich. The forces employed represent Germany's last mobile reserves. The resources concentrated in the West cannot be replaced, and the defense of the Eastern Front is weakened just when the Soviet Union is preparing to launch its offensive on the Oder. Guderian's calculations confirm that the panzer divisions available in January of 1945 are insufficient even to cover the Vistula line. The political impact of the defeat is also profound. Hitler dismisses several commanders of the Western Front and further centralizes decisions. The relationship with his general staff deteriorates. The operation, conceived as a show of strength, becomes a symbol of isolation. The High Command documents, dated at the beginning of January, acknowledge that the Wehrmacht has exhausted its offensive capability. However, internal propaganda presents the withdrawal as a planned retreat. In the newsreels, images of tanks advancing through the snow are accompanied by reports speaking of thousands of enemies defeated. The illusion of a resurgence is maintained for a few days, enough to justify new mobilization measures. During that brief period, the regime uses the apparent victory to reactivate the call for total resistance. The recruitment of teenagers and older men is intensified, internal discipline is reinforced, and calls for absolute loyalty multiply. But when the reality of failure prevails, the discourse transforms. It is no longer about promising an imminent victory, but about the duty to resist to the end. Defeat becomes a moral argument. In the January meetings, Hitler asserts that only stubbornness can preserve the honor of the Reich. The war ceases to have concrete military objectives and becomes a matter of will. The German fortress resists until death. In January of 1945, when the defeat of the Reich is already irreversible, Adolf Hitler adopts his last military doctrine, total resistance. From then on, every city, port, or frontline position must be transformed into a Festung, a fortress intended to hold out to the last man. The decision does not arise from a strategic calculation, but from an ideological conviction that willpower can replace material means and that collective sacrifice can redeem defeat. On the 12th of January, the Red Army launches the Vistula-Oder offensive. Soviet forces break the German front in a sector of nearly 500 kilometers and advance from Warsaw to the Oder River in less than 3 weeks. The defenses dissolve, thousands of soldiers retreat without orders, and millions of civilians flee westward. The collapse is general. In the midst of this breakdown, Hitler rejects any organized withdrawal. In meetings held in the Chancellery bunker and in Zossen, he orders that each city resist on its own. Local commands will receive absolute authority to defend their position and will be isolated if necessary. On the 20th of January, the order for the defense of the cities and fortresses of the Reich is issued. The decree turns the German territory into a network of fixed positions surrounded by a mobile enemy. In that logic, losing a fortress is equivalent to committing treason. The war ceases to be a military matter and becomes a question of ideological faith. The compliance with the order does not fall on the regular army, but on the Gauleiter, the regional leaders of the Nazi Party. Each one becomes the defense commander of their area, with authority over the armed forces, the police, and the civil administration. The military structure is thus fragmented. On the Eastern Front, the Heeresgruppe Weichsel, created on the 24th of January under the command of Heinrich Himmler, must coordinate the operations in Pomerania and West Prussia. In practice, the real control belongs to the Gauleiter, who communicate directly with Berlin. The result is a dual chain of command and an operational chaos. The orders of the army contradict those of the party, and numerous garrisons are isolated without communication. The case of Karl Hanke, Gauleiter of Breslau, symbolizes this policy. Hitler appoints him commander of the Festung Breslau, granting him absolute power over all local institutions. His mission is to maintain the city at any cost, even when it is already encircled. Between January and March, more than 20 cities receive the same designation: Königsberg, Breslau, Poznan, and Kolberg among the most important. All share the same fate: encirclement, isolation, prolonged resistance, and almost total destruction. Königsberg, former capital of East Prussia, is surrounded by the Red Army at the end of January. Hitler orders its defense as a symbol of Prussian loyalty. General Otto Lasch is ordered to resist without possible retreat. The city, saturated with civilians and refugees, is subjected to a 3-month siege. Air supplies from the Samland Peninsula are insufficient. Soviet artillery destroys a large part of the buildings, and civilian casualties exceed tens of thousands. When Lasch surrenders on April 9th, he is sentenced to death in absentia for treason. In Silesia, Breslau is declared a fortress on the 22nd of January. Hanke orders the evacuation of women and children, but most of the inhabitants remain trapped. The First Ukrainian Front closes the encirclement at the beginning of February. The city is transformed into an urban defensive system. Barricades are erected, bridges are mined, and buildings are demolished to create shooting fields. The garrison resists until May, even after the fall of Berlin. The population survives without water or electricity for months. When the city capitulates on the 6th of May, fewer than 200,000 inhabitants remain from the original 600,000. Further west, Poznan is surrounded on January 25th. Its garrison, of about 15,000 men, entrenches itself in the central citadel, a complex of fortifications from the 19th century. The house-to-house fighting reduces the city to ruins. The siege ends on February 23rd with the death of General Ernst Matten and the capture of the last defenders. The Baltic port of Kolberg, designated a fortress on the 1st of March, was to serve as an evacuation point for civilians and troops. Hitler also considers it a symbol of resistance. Soviet forces surround it on the 4th of March, and the garrison holds out until the 18th, when the last defenders are evacuated by sea. The city is set on fire and practically wiped off the map. The doctrine of the Festungen is based on a simple idea: force the enemy to bypass each city and delay their advance. In theory, this was supposed to buy time to reorganize the fronts. In practice, the immobilized garrisons cannot maneuver or receive support. The relief units, when they exist, are insufficient. Commanders understand that fortifications lack tactical sense in a war dominated by heavy artillery and aviation. Urban defense becomes a matter of time, not strategy. But no authority can contradict the orders of the Führer. Resistance is an absolute mandate. The Reich's logistics system collapses under this policy. Thousands of trains loaded with supplies are stopped because the routes to the besieged cities are cut off. The fuel and ammunition that could be redistributed are lost in bombed stations. The fortification policy aggravates civilian suffering. Evacuations are late or impossible. In East Prussia and Pomerania, the winter and lack of transport turn displacements into catastrophes. Hundreds of thousands attempt to flee on congested roads or seek boarding in collapsed ports. Reports from the German Red Cross and the Navy document the evacuation of more than 2 million people across the Baltic between January and May, but thousands die frozen or under bombardment. The sinkings of the ships Wilhelm Gustloff and Goya, with tens of thousands of refugees, are a direct consequence of the order to keep cities fighting until the end. In the areas declared strongholds, civilians are trapped without shelter or food. In Breslau, hunger and epidemics surpass bombings in casualties. In Königsberg, the decomposition of corpses causes diseases among the survivors. The fanaticism demanded by Hitler is imposed through terror. Emergency courts with the power to execute anyone expressing an intention to surrender are established in each fortress. Officers, soldiers, and civilians are shot for defeatism or dereliction of duty. In Breslau, more than 700 people are executed during the siege by order of the Gauleiter. In Königsberg and Poznan, officers proposing to capitulate are arrested and replaced by party members. The Reich Ministry of Justice archives, preserved in post-war trials, record more than 3,000 summary executions in the East between January and March, all supported by the doctrine of total resistance. As the fortresses fall one after another, Hitler orders the implementation of an even more radical measure: the destruction of all infrastructure that could be useful to the enemy. The decree known as Nero-Befehl is issued on the 19th of March. It orders the demolition of bridges, factories, railways, and power plants. The Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, understands that this order means the annihilation of the country. Although he formally complies, he secretly coordinates with some Gauleiter to preserve essential facilities. In several regions, local officers discreetly disobey, aware that the war is lost. In the still besieged cities, the destructions do come true. In Kolberg and Poznan, the defenders blow up depots and factories before surrendering. In Silesia, the bridges over the Oder are demolished while thousands of civilians try to cross them. The application of the Festungen doctrine reveals the decomposition of the command system. While the Heeresgruppe Weichsel tries to maintain a coherent defensive line, the Gauleiter act on their own account. Himmler, without military experience, remains in Berlin and issues contradictory orders. The army ceases to operate as a hierarchical structure. Each fortress becomes an isolated cell. Communications are interrupted and coordination disappears. Isolation turns resistance into a symbol. Fortress cities stop having a military function and come to represent obedience to the Führer. Each one must demonstrate that its faith surpasses defeat. Between January and March, the majority of the Festungen designated are destroyed or captured. Königsberg falls in April, Breslau in May, and the rest disappears within a few weeks. Only ruins remain, with neither strategic value nor population. The human losses are incalculable. More than 1 million civilians and soldiers die or disappear in the process of defending the East. Soviet reports record entire populations razed without significant military presence. The total resistance does not delay the Allied advance in any appreciable way. It only prolongs the war for a few weeks and multiplies the devastation. The Reich, without operational capacity, retreats into its own ideology. Discipline, fear, and propaganda substitute for planning. As the fortresses of the East fall, Hitler's attention focuses on a single point: Berlin. In his vision, the capital must become the supreme fortress, the stage of the final confrontation that will test the loyalty of the German people. The experiences of Königsberg, Breslau, and Kolberg serve as a model for the orders that will soon transform the capital into a battlefield. Berlin under siege, the capital turned into ruin. In March of 1945, the capital of the Reich ceases to be a city at war and transforms into the nucleus of a political and military apparatus whose purpose is not victory, but persistence. With the Red Army on the Oder and the Western Allies crossing the Rhine, Adolf Hitler decides to remain in Berlin. The resolution does not respond to a tactical logic, but to a symbolic one, to concentrate in the capital the representation of the last resistance, to affirm that the power of the state remains active, and to transform the urban space into a stage for discipline and propaganda. Berlin will be the emblem and the laboratory of the end. Between the end of February and the beginning of March, Hitler receives reports describing the breakdown of the Eastern Front, the loss of Pomerania, and the Allied advance from the west. Military alternatives exist, moving the government to the Alpine region, establishing an administrative center in the north or in Flensburg, or creating a stronghold in Bavaria. He rejects them all. His presence in the capital ensures the centralization of command, the appearance of continuity, and the consolidation of sacrifice as doctrine. Remaining in Berlin means controlling orders, supervising propaganda, and giving visible form to the slogan of resistance. In his interpretation, the city is not a military target, but an argument. The regime still trusts that the Soviet advance can be briefly halted at the Oder, and that this pause will allow for the reorganization of defenses or foster rifts among allies. The expectation lacks an operational basis, but it serves to justify the Führer's permanence. With the capital as the focus, the strategy reduces to fortifying the urban terrain and constructing the narrative of total resistance. The defense of Berlin is structured in successive rings. The outer belt uses the green belt, the lakes and the canals combined with the industrial suburbs to form staggered positions. Roads and highways are blocked with anti-tank ditches and metal obstacles. The middle belt follows the main avenues and tram lines with strong points at crossroads and plazas reinforced with concrete. The inner belt protects the chancellery and government buildings, concentrating the defense of the bridges over the Spree and communications. Each district receives a sector of responsibility with a commander subordinate to the Gau of Berlin. Orders establish that each sector must resist even if cut off, following the doctrine of the eastern fortresses. Anti-aircraft batteries are oriented to ground fire. Flak cannons cover avenues, and portable launchers are distributed in street corners. Intersections are transformed into strong points with barricades of overturned trams and welded rails. The reorganization extends to everyday life. Each block has a civilian and a military person in charge of the shelters, access control, and relief. The police and civil defense manage internal evacuation routes aimed not at leaving the city but at relocating families within areas considered safe. Schools become food supply depots or Volkssturm centers. Theaters store light weapons. Churches serve as observation posts. Out-of-service trams reinforce barricades, and underground tunnels are classified by their usefulness for covered personnel movement or for connecting depots and hospitals. The mobilization of the Volkssturm reaches its peak in March. Every man between 16 and 60 years not integrated into regular units is obligated to join. The training is brief: handling of the anti-tank rifle Panzerfaust, basic shooting and street maneuvers. The formations are organized by neighborhoods with commanders designated by the party. The allocations are irregular, with incomplete uniforms and weaponry of diverse origin. The Volkssturm is assigned fixed defensive tasks, like holding crossroads or protecting essential infrastructures. Veterans and workers with technical experience guard power plants, water facilities, and municipal bakeries. The distribution of Panzerfaust is prioritized, and shooter pairs are instructed to act from inner courtyards with predefined withdrawal routes. Each vehicle stopped or diverted should mean time gained. The flak system, conceived for aerial defense, adapts to ground combat. The anti-aircraft towers, concrete structures with hospitals, depots, and shelters, are incorporated into the inner belt. The 88mm pieces are assigned to the long axes, and crossfire angles are calculated along wide avenues. The buildings are reinforced to withstand recoil in direct fire. These fortifications function both as communication centers and field hospitals, with thousands of civilians sheltered inside. Sustaining the city requires a survival logistics. The municipal administration, under the control of the Gau, sets quotas for bread, potatoes, and fats. Bakeries and slaughterhouses receive armed protection. Field kitchens fueled with recovered coal and demolition wood are improvised. The water network is damaged, so wells and park reservoirs are registered as secondary sources. The water must be boiled before distribution to prevent dysentery outbreaks. Power is reserved for hospitals and pumping stations. Public lighting is kept to a minimum, and tram lines are used as manual transport for the injured and freight. The healthcare system is organized into 3 levels: main hospitals for surgery, neighborhood clinics for stabilization, and aid stations in basements. Mobile teams transport the wounded on stretchers and improvised sleds. The municipal pharmacy centralizes morphine and suture materials, and each sector receives minor surgery kits. Auxiliary personnel are trained in hemorrhage control and fracture immobilization. The city is fortifying itself. In addition to the large shelters and underground stations, each building reinforces its basements with interior walls and struts. Passages are opened between adjacent buildings to allow movement without going to the surface. The subway and railway tunnels serve as logistical link routes. Shelter signs are painted with resistant materials, and each building appoints a person in charge to control access, ventilation, and the registration of occupants. The objective is to maintain order and minimum survival statistics per sector. While urban engineering turns Berlin into a fortress, Joseph Goebbels defines the narrative framework. His propaganda insists on 3 concepts: sacrifice, apocalypse, and honor. Sacrifice as a demonstration of loyalty, apocalypse as a metaphor for the final confrontation, and honor as the equivalence between resistance and dignity. Radio broadcasts proclaim that every house is a fortress and every Berliner a soldier. The pamphlets associate the Prussian tradition with urban defense and list civil duties, collaborating with the Volkssturm, maintaining demolition tools, conserving first aid kits. In the newsreels, images of barricades and women carrying bricks replace military reports. The language avoids casualties and repeats verbs of perseverance. The objective is not to inform, but to produce obedience. Defensive tasks multiply. Engineers and civilian crews demolish unstable buildings to create rubble fields that prevent the passage of armored vehicles. Secondary bridges are prepared for demolition, and steel obstacles are installed on avenues. Parks, including the Tiergarten, are cleared for shooting lines, while canals are blocked with sunken barges. Factories become bastions. Their concrete structures allow the placement of automatic weapons, and the chimneys serve as observatories for visual signals to coordinate short movements when radios fail. Communication between sectors takes on multiple forms. Underground telephone lines are prioritized, and messengers on bicycles or foot with fixed routes are organized. Panels and lamps with agreed codes are used on rooftops. Situation bulletins are manually printed with reusable templates to indicate line changes or areas closed due to collapses. Redundancy is essential. Orders circulate in multiple copies by messengers, with passwords and seals to prevent forgeries. The rationing is reviewed each week. The booklets are stamped by staircase and street. The mandatory work is divided into shifts: debris clearance, fortification, transport, and night repairs. A material bank is created with sleepers, beams, sandbags, and tools. Mixed brigades composed of technicians, workers, and members of the Volkssturm maintain minimal water and electricity services. The substations have armed guards and generators. Internal control is reinforced: curfews, circulation passes, and checks at intersections. Each courtyard with an exit to several streets is equipped with reinforced doors and resident registration officers. Patrols composed of police, party, and Volkssturm check the conservation of weapons and tools. Schools and neighborhood associations distribute brief manuals on urban combat, moving close to walls, detecting fires, recognizing pauses in artillery, and using wet blankets against phosphorus. A common emergency vocabulary is disseminated to simplify oral communications. Propaganda consolidates the myth of Berlin as the last bastion. It is not just about physical resistance, but about the affirmation of political existence. Speeches insist that as long as the capital resists, the Reich remains alive. The message links Prussian heritage with the idea of collective sacrifice. Posters and armbands reaffirm belonging. The myth gives meaning to the repetitive tasks of defense, sustains discipline, and reduces psychological exhaustion. Despite the meticulous preparation, the limits are evident. The ammunition is scarce and distributed in small, vulnerable depots. The fuel barely suffices for ambulances and generators. The artillery lacks spare parts, and the available field guns are few. The Volkssturm provides presence, not firepower. The wide streets and straight axes offer the enemy natural corridors once the outer rings are overcome. The central bridges are simultaneously vital and fragile. The fragmentation of command by sectors hinders any coordinated maneuver. In mid-April, the Red Army crosses the Oder at various points, and the advanced defenses are exhausted. Berlin has completed its setup. Defined barricades, batteries with assigned ground fire sectors, units quartered in schools and factories, dispersed depots, and marked underground routes. Hospitals are redistributed to avoid overcrowding. Shelters have minimum reserves, and repair brigades operate at night to maintain water and light in critical nodes. The Gau issues final instructions: reinforce access to the administrative center, preserve bridges until the demolition order, restrict civil movement, limit fuel consumption, and prioritize anti-tank ammunition for the intersections. The operational slogan is simple and definitive: disperse, delay, wear down. The internal betrayal, the regime that devoured itself. At the beginning of March of 1945, while Berlin prepares for the final defense, the power of the regime is concentrated underground in a set of rooms in the garden of the Chancellery. The Führerbunker, built as an air raid shelter, has become the last command center of a state that no longer exists on the surface. Inside, the remnants of the government, the military commands, and the party leaders meet. What had been a hierarchical structure is reduced to a narrow circle presided over by a sick man, dependent on filtered reports and sustained by a system of personal loyalties and fear. The underground complex consists of two levels: the Vorbunker, built in 1936, and the Führerbunker, deeper, completed in 1944 with thick concrete walls. By mid-March, when Hitler decides to stay in the capital, about 40 people move into the premises: secretaries, medical assistants, liaison officers, and members of the general staff. Communication with the outside depends on telephones, shortwave radio, and messengers, all under the control of Martin Bormann, head of the party chancellery. His position grants him absolute power. He decides which messages reach the Führer, which news is omitted, and what tone the reports should have. The information no longer describes reality, it protects an illusion, that of a still manageable front and obedient commands. The reports of the Heeresgruppe Weixel, the Oberkommando des Heeres, and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht are summarized and corrected before being presented. Losses are minimized and Soviet advances are described as tactical withdrawals. The reporting system stops being an instrument of command to become a mechanism of bureaucratic self-defense. Decisions are based on incomplete data. When Hitler orders impossible counterattacks or requests the reorganization of divisions already destroyed, no one dares to correct him. Officers who try to present real figures, like General Hans Krebs, are marginalized. The direction of the front becomes a symbolic representation. The map replaces the territory. On the surface, the chancellery is destroyed. Underground, the hierarchies are reordered according to physical proximity to the Führer. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, becomes the interpreter of the final message. He remains almost permanently in the bunker, where he is responsible for maintaining the ideological coherence of the collapse. Bormann controls the administration, filters the correspondence, and regulates access to Hitler. His authority comes from the isolation. Nothing enters or leaves without his mediation. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, maintains irregular contact from the north. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and designated successor by decree of 1941, is in Bavaria with only nominal power. Among them, loyalty is apparent. Each seeks to preserve their position in the face of the imminent collapse. Bormann understands that control depends on managing hopelessness. The messages to the Führer follow a pattern: omit defeats, exaggerate promises of reinforcements, and maintain the fiction of non-existent unit movements. The manipulation no longer pursues victory, but rather maintaining Hitler's personal authority. The leader's distrust of his generals is total. Any pessimistic report can be considered treason. Maps are colored with static lines to simulate stability, numbers are rounded, and reports are written with calculated ambiguity. Military truth disappears. Orders insisting on holding positions or launching offensives without real means are ritual acts, gestures of power in an operational void. The 20th of April, Hitler's birthday, marks the turning point. While outside, the Red Army begins the assault on the suburbs. Inside, a minimal ceremony is held. That same day, in Obersalzberg, Göring interprets that, according to the decree that designates him successor, he must assume command if the Führer is cut off. On the 21st, he sends a telegram requesting confirmation of his authority. The message, intercepted by Bormann, is presented as an attempted coup. Hitler reacts with fury, orders his dismissal and arrest. Göring's communication destroys the last ties between the regime's leaders. From that moment on, any initiative outside the bunker is defined as treason. Power ceases to be institutional to become exclusively personal. In parallel, Himmler seeks contacts with the Western Allies through Count Volker Bernadotte, Swedish representative of the Red Cross. His goal is to negotiate a partial surrender to the West and maintain resistance against the Soviet Union. He attempts to preserve the SS as a useful force in the post-war period. When Hitler learns of the maneuver, he reacts with the same pattern of anger. On the 28th of April, he orders his expulsion from all positions and his arrest. Inside the bunker, the news reinforces the feeling of moral siege. Whoever is outside is an enemy. Whoever remains close is loyal. Loyalty is measured in physical presence. Of all those who remain there, only Goebbels retains direct influence. As the situation worsens, he takes on broader tasks: coordination of civil defense, control of internal communications, and staff discipline. He directs the daily ritual, schedules, meals, reports, and updates. His mission is to sustain the discourse of sacrifice. Each defeat is interpreted as proof of loyalty. For him, to resist is not a tactic, but a historical duty. Survival is meaningless without obedience. When Hitler names him Chancellor in his political testament, the designation is symbolic, but reinforces the idea of continuity. The state no longer exists, but the gesture preserves the appearance of order. Martin Bormann concentrates administrative power. He oversees food, correspondence, messengers, and document destruction. No paper reaches the Führer without his review. His attitude combines apparent loyalty and personal calculation. While the regime collapses, he prepares escape routes and protects selected files. He knows that the party is dissolved, but maintains the semblance of normality to prevent the psychological disintegration of the group. In those days, his signature regulates the underground life: guards, breaks, distribution of water and rations. When Hitler falls ill or isolates himself, Bormann issues orders in his name, prolonging the fiction of an operational command. The bunker functions as an empty decision-making machine. Each night, maps of a non-existent front are reviewed. Generals Krebs and Bergdorf present reports on dispersed or destroyed units. Hitler orders counterattacks to the north and the west with divisions that only exist in the files. Communications with the outside are reduced to coded messages that no one answers. In practice, the Führerbunker is disconnected from the army but continues issuing orders. The function of command has become an administrative ritual. While documents are signed, power is considered to be in force. The attendees maintain the routine out of habit and fear. Reports are prepared, papers are sealed, communiques are drafted. Each bureaucratic act prolongs the fiction of governance. On the surface, Soviet artillery already falls on the center of Berlin, but underground the voices continue talking about movements and reinforcements. The contrast between the noise outside and the formality inside defines the final state of the regime, a system that persists by inertia. On the night of the 29th to the 30th of April, Hitler dictates his political and personal testaments. In them, he reorganizes a government that no longer has territory. Goebbels is named Chancellor, Bormann Minister of the Party, and Karl Dönitz, Naval Commander, President of the Reich. The act serves a symbolic function, reaffirming authority and providing a legal framework for the end. Drafting the document is a way to maintain order amid collapse. Internally, it is interpreted as closure. The power structure must survive the Führer, even if just for a few hours. From then on, the leadership of the state is divided between the Bunker Corps and the new Naval Command in the north, which will attempt to manage the remnants of the country after the dictator's death. Life in the bunker oscillates between mechanical work and waiting. The routines repeat without purpose. The sound of artillery accompanies the hours with no difference between day and night. Personal relationships intensify. Loyalty is confused with coexistence. The attendants, including Junge, Linger and Gunsche, maintain discipline, aware that time is running out. The officers prepare documents that nobody will read. Outside, the city crumbles. Inside, the language remains administrative. Orders, passwords, schedules. Hitler appears increasingly weakened with tremors and episodes of exhaustion. The surrounding environment interprets the signs as a warning of an imminent outcome. The priority is to maintain the image of control. Loyalty, in that context, ceases to be a moral virtue and becomes a requirement for survival. Those who doubt are removed. Those who obey are protected. The fear of being considered a traitor maintains cohesion. The structure purges itself, sustained by the habit of obedience. Goebbels, Bormann, and the remaining officers act as guardians of a liturgy. Each order issued is an act of faith in the continuity of power. In their interpretation, loyalty replaces victory. While the other commands have failed, they remain faithful. That conviction justifies the confinement and gives meaning to the final sacrifice. The Führerbunker thus becomes the metaphor of a regime that, having lost all capacity for action, turns obedience into its last principle of existence. The internal enemy, the Reich against its own. Between January and April of 1945, the Third Reich wages a war on two fronts, against the enemy armies advancing over its territory and against its own population within that territory. When military defeat becomes irreversible, the regime turns internal repression into its last instrument of authority. Executions, summary courts, and the persecution of defeatism become routine. The state, incapable of defending its borders, can only sustain itself by punishing those it considers responsible for its downfall. The punitive radicalization begins after the Soviet offensive in January. Hitler interprets the loss of East Prussia and Silesia not as a result of the adversary's military superiority, but as a lack of will. From the bunker, he dictates orders that define disobedience as treason and unauthorized withdrawal as cowardice. These provisions are incorporated into the Emergency Military Penal Code, modified to allow immediate executions without higher review. In a total war, any doubt becomes sabotage. Commanders gain the power to execute on the spot soldiers or civilians who hinder the defense. The change of tone is absolute. The orders no longer seek to maintain discipline but replace it with terror. The terms withdrawal or surrender disappear from the official language. Instead, formulas like defense without reservations or resistance to the last bullet are repeated. To implement these directives, Fliegende Standgerichte, itinerant military courts, are created, which operate near the front or at the rear. Each is made up of 3 officers, a clerk, and a firing squad. Their task is to summarily judge cases of cowardice, position abandonment, or defeatism. They move in vehicles or trains and set up wherever local command reports in discipline. The procedure does not exceed 20 minutes. There is no defense or appeal. In many cases, the sentence is decided before the trial. Executions are immediate, often in ditches or barracks yards, in front of the accused's comrades. Between January and April of 1945, thousands of German soldiers are shot by these courts. High Command records indicate more than 7,000 death sentences on the Eastern Front. The aim is not to restore discipline, but to set an example. Each execution intends to reaffirm the Führer's authority amid the collapse. Obedience replaces hope. The collapse of the front causes massive desertions. Thousands of wounded or unitless soldiers try to return home. The propaganda calls them traitors. SS and Feldgendarmerie patrols, the military police, stop them on roads and at stations. Those who cannot justify their presence are accused of desertion. In recent weeks, it is enough to have a damaged uniform or lack insignia to be suspicious. In some cases, civilians using military garments to protect themselves from the cold are executed by mistake or excessive zeal. The disorganization of communications prevents verification of orders or confirming unit membership. Many are condemned just for not being able to prove identity. The fear of being detained leads others to destroy documents, which increases the risk. Obedience is maintained through the threat. While the army exercises its summary justice at the front, the Gauleiter and party leaders bring this practice to the interior of the Reich. With plenipotentiary authority, they can order executions for defeatism, rumors, or unpatriotic behavior. Cities designated as Festungen, like Breslau or Königsberg, become scenes of political terror. Party officials roam shelters and basements to arrest those who express doubts about victory. In the villages, executions are carried out in squares or schoolyards, with signs labeling traitor or coward. Public punishment replaces the judicial process. Authority becomes visible in the act of killing. The SS play a central role in this repression. In addition to executing sentences, they organize cleaning operations in the rear. Special groups arrest those who try to surrender or negotiate with the Allies. Himmler personally orders the executions of commanders who retreat without permission. In his ideology, disobedience is a crime against the race and against the Führer. The wounded or sick are objects of suspicion. Inspections are carried out in field hospitals. Those who can walk are returned to the front under threat of death. At the same time, the SS oversee the evacuation of the concentration camps. Tens of thousands of prisoners are forced to march inland on the so-called death marches. Those who cannot continue are executed on the roadsides. Although different in context, these operations follow the same logic, denying surrender even at the cost of their own lives. The regime turns internal violence into a message. Local newspapers and loudspeakers announce exemplary executions and publish lists of convicted individuals. Slogans such as "Punishment renews faith" are repeated. Public execution becomes a pedagogical act. The families of the condemned are forced to attend. The objective is to replace the notion of victory with that of purity. While the front collapses, the sacrifice of the supposed weak maintains the fiction of an intact community. On the 19th of March, Hitler signs the Nero Order, Nero Befehl, which orders the destruction of all industrial, energy and transport facilities that may fall into enemy hands. The instruction is equivalent to a decree of self-destruction. Factories, bridges and stations must be demolished without regard for the civilian population. The armaments minister, Albert Speer, understands the consequences and seeks to sabotage the order. Through encrypted messages, he asks to preserve essential infrastructures. In some regions, his instructions are obeyed. In others, the Gauleiter execute the destruction with fanatical zeal. The tension between obedience and sabotage defines the final weeks of the Reich. Following the orders means destroying the country. Disobeying them equals treason. Many engineers and mayors fake demolitions or delay executions. In other places, that disobedience is paid with life. The military files record numerous cases. On the Eastern Front, commanders shot for retreating some kilometers. In East Prussia, a general executed for evacuating civilians. In Bavaria, workers hanged for spreading rumors about the arrival of the Allies. In Berlin, mixed party and police patrols arrest anyone who talks about surrender. The line between crime and comment disappears. Justice becomes a reflection of collective fear. As the front dissolves, the punitive system loses coherence. The execution orders multiply, but the executioners begin to doubt. In some cases, the squads refuse to shoot and are shot in turn. The fear of punishing and being punished coexists within the same units. The officers issue orders knowing that no one will comply, and the soldiers pretend to obey them. Formal discipline is maintained, but authority has been emptied. The flying courts disappear amidst the chaos. Some judges flee, others are captured. The executions continue in a scattered manner without coordination or sense. Punishment loses its original function. It no longer disciplines, it only confirms the impotence of the system. In the last days of the Reich, the act of punishing ceases to be linked to law and becomes ideological affirmation. Shooting a coward or hanging a defeatist is equivalent to demonstrating that power still exists. Each execution is an attempt at symbolic reconstruction of the lost order. Official speeches insist that the true enemy is within. This idea, present since the origins of the regime, reaches its extreme when the external enemy already occupies almost the whole country. The war against the Allies transforms into a war against the people themselves. Local authorities cling to punishment as the last proof of loyalty. When no order can alter the military outcome, executing a suspect is considered a moral victory. Repression becomes a bureaucratic rite of loyalty. In April, with the Red Army crossing the Oder and the Allies occupying the north and the south, the repressive apparatus fragments. The Gauleiter flee or commit suicide. The courts stop operating. The prisons are opened. However, in several cities, party patrols continue shooting civilians even after the Allies enter. Old orders continue being executed even though the authority has disappeared. The fall of the East, the Red Army over Germany. On the 12th of January 1945, the Soviet offensive of the Vistula-Oder marks the beginning of the military collapse of the Third Reich. In less than 3 weeks, the Red Army covers more than 500 kilometers, destroys the German defense and stands at the gates of Berlin. No previous operation had achieved such a rapid advance over such a wide territory. The eastern border of the Reich, built over years as a defensive wall, vanishes in a matter of days. At the end of 1944, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, plans a strategic offensive to eliminate the German army groups still defending Poland and East Prussia. The main forces, led by Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, are concentrated on two fronts: the first Belarusian front facing Warsaw and the first Ukrainian front facing Silesia. The plan calls for a simultaneous attack along the Vistula to reach the Oder without interruption. The numerical superiority is overwhelming. More than 2 million soldiers, 30,000 artillery pieces, 6,000 tanks, and 5,000 aircraft. In contrast, the German forces barely gather 400,000 men with less than 1,000 operational tanks. On January 12th, after an unprecedented intensity artillery bombardment, the lines of Heeresgruppe A, commanded by Harp and later by Schörner, collapse at multiple points. In 48 hours, the German divisions cease to exist as coherent units. The Polish front disappears. The Soviet troops advance at a mean speed of 30 kilometers daily. The magnitude of the blow disorganizes the Oberkommando des Heeres in Zossen and disconcerts Hitler in Berlin. Communications are interrupted, messages contradict each other, and maps become useless. Despite this, the Central Command insists on maintaining the positions. Orders demanding immediate resistance reach units that are already in retreat or destroyed. Within a matter of days, the Heeresgruppe A loses contact with its corps. The local commanders attempt to regroup, but they lack fuel, transportation, and ammunition. The High Command orders impossible counterattacks based on divisions that exist only in the files. The reports that reach Berlin are corrected to hide the magnitude of the disaster. In East Prussia, The Heeresgruppe center holds out longer, although it remains isolated. Hitler's orders prohibit any retreat to the west, arguing that it would open the way to the capital. The decision condemns hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians trapped in the Baltic and Prussian provinces. East Prussia, the historic core of German militarism, becomes a field of ruins. Tilsit, Gumbinnen and Allenstein fall in a few days. The garrison of Königsberg, declared a fortress, fights surrounded and without land evacuation. The Baltic Sea is the only escape route. The Navy organizes Operation Hannibal, the largest maritime evacuation of the war. More than 2 million civilians and soldiers attempt to flee westward under constant attacks. The sinking of the ships Wilhelm Gustloff, Goya, and Steuben, with tens of thousands of dead, illustrates the chaos of that exodus. By mid-March, East Prussia ceases to exist as a military entity. To the south, Konev's First Ukrainian Front crosses the upper Oder and penetrates Silesia. Oppeln, Gleiwitz and Katowice fall in a few weeks. The German resistance is irregular. Some garrisons surrender, others are annihilated by obeying the order not to retreat. The Gauleiter Karl Hanke applies the policy of Festungen and orders Breslau to be held at all costs. Surrounded on the 13th of February, the city resists until May, isolated and destroyed. The loss of Silesia deprives the Reich of its last industrial center and cuts off land communication with the south. The front fragments into disconnected pockets, while the railway lines to Berlin are rendered useless. The Soviet advance from the Vistula to the Oder constitutes one of the fastest operations of modern war. Zhukov's troops cross Poznan and Łódź and reach the river by the end of January. Kustrin and Frankfurt on the Oder become key points. In response, the Heeresgruppe Weichsel is created under the command of Heinrich Himmler. The choice of a political chief without military experience reflects the breakdown of command. The units under his control are remnants of divisions and battalions of the Volkssturm without coordination or sufficient armament. In mid-February, the Red Army establishes bridgeheads in several sectors of the Oder. The counterattacks ordered by Berlin fail with massive losses. The supposed natural barrier becomes a symbolic line. Kustrin, a fortress at the confluence of the Oder and the Warta, becomes the first bastion on the road to Berlin. Hitler orders to resist to the last man. Surrounded since the beginning of February, the garrison fights among ruins. Rescue attempts fail. In mid-March, the city is razed and taken. Its fall leaves the highway to the capital open. For the Soviets, the Oder is no longer an obstacle. For the Germans, its loss marks the point of no return. As the Red Army advances, orders from the bunker become contradictory. The Oberkommando des Heeres demands to hold fixed lines while commanders in the field request authorization to retreat or evacuate civilians. Hitler rejects all retreats, convinced that willpower can compensate for material inferiority. The disconnect between political authority and military reality becomes absolute. Divisions receive non-executable instructions: defend rivers without bridges, attack with tanks without fuel, protect cities already lost. The command disintegrates. In some sectors, officers destroy their radios to avoid receiving new orders. The Gauleiter impose their own policies, often opposed to military ones. While the generals try to preserve troops, the party leaders demand total sacrifice. In Silesia, this rivalry paralyzes evacuations and condemns thousands of civilians trapped between opposing commands. The Soviet advance generates the largest population movement in Europe since the beginning of the conflict. Millions of Germans from the east flee westward in the middle of winter. Caravans of refugees, overloaded trains, and columns on foot travel along frozen paths. Casualties from cold, bombings, and disorganization reach immense numbers. The roads become routes of disaster. The civilian columns mix with retreating military units. Trains with the wounded and families saturate stations and side tracks. Supply convoys collapse. The result is a mass in motion without direction or protection. The logistical collapse directly affects defense. Blocked roads prevent movements of troops and supplies. The columns of refugees unknowingly serve as an involuntary shield. The Red Army advances among fleeing populations and captures localities without combat. German reports estimate that more than 8 million people are displaced between January and April. A part die before reaching the Elbe. The eastern border ceases to be a military line and becomes a corridor of social disintegration. The blowing up of bridges is one of the few measures still effectively applied, although the lack of coordination causes errors. Some structures are destroyed before the troops cross them. Others are kept too long, allowing the enemy to pass. The railway system, overwhelmed by the refugees, comes to a halt. The locomotives lack coal, the trains remain immobile, and telegraphic communications are cut off. The Eastern Front fragments into isolated islands. The records of the Heeresgruppe Weichsel indicate that by mid-March, only a fraction of the planned ammunition and fuel reaches its destination. The rest is lost under aerial fire or in the confusion of the transports. By the end of March, Soviet forces consolidate positions on the Oder-Neisse line, the last natural frontier before the capital. The German army tries to organize the so-called Oder Front with remnants of divisions, volunteers from the Volkssturm and scattered armored units. Hitler's orders are clear: hold the line at any cost. In practice, the positions are poorly fortified and lack artillery. The Soviet command accumulates troops and material for the final assault. The contrast is absolute. On one side, a weary and fragmented army. On the other, a massive force with total superiority in firepower and mobility. On the 16th of April, the Battle of the Seelow Heights begins, the last attempt to stop the offensive towards Berlin. The German forces resist for 4 days before breaking. The road to the capital lies open. In 3 months, Germany loses more than 500,000 soldiers among the dead, wounded, and prisoners. The reserves disappear, weapon depots are captured, and the eastern cities are left in ruins.